studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Wednesday, February 11th, 2015. A new report on lynchings in the United States reveals that the gruesome practice was far more common than previously thought. We'll speak with the report's author, Bryan Stevenson, of the Equal Justice Initiative. And Professor William Black will disentangle the latest scandal involving the world's second largest bank, HSBC. That's coming up today after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Courtney Morris. She's an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. Hi, Courtney.
Hi, Sonali.
3 Muslim students from the same family were killed by gunfire yesterday evening in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Police this morning arrested a 46-year-old white man named Craig Stephen Hicks in connection to the shootings that many in the community believe were motivated by Islamophobia. The victims were 23-year-old Dia Shadi Barakat, his 21-year-old wife Yusra Abu Salha, and her 19-year-old sister Razan Mohammed Abu Salha. Mr. Barakat and his wife, who had just gotten married a month ago, were from Chapel Hill, while the younger sister was from Raleigh. The deaths have prompted a Twitter campaign called #MuslimLivesMatter. CARE, the nation's leading Muslim civil rights organization, released a statement saying, quote, based on the brutal nature of this crime, the past anti-religion statements of the alleged perpetrator, the religious attire of 2 of the victims, and the rising anti-Muslim rhetoric in American society, we urge state and federal law enforcement authorities to quickly address speculation of a possible bias motive in the case. Now, Courtney, if indeed this was a hate crime, how serious a problem do we have here in the U.S. of Islamophobia?
Well, I mean, obviously, we're going to have to wait for all of the evidence to come in to determine whether this shooting was, in fact, racially motivated. But I think my skepticism is probably shared by many who very seriously doubt, as the Chapel Hill police have claimed, that these 3 young people were killed over a dispute over a parking spot. Islamophobia is a global phenomenon, as we've seen in recent weeks in events in Europe and elsewhere. And the problem is no less pronounced here in the United States and has been deepening and worsening, I would argue, since September 11th, 2001. So this is a very serious problem that we need to deal with. And these deaths are the tragic outcome of increased Islamophobia, I think, everywhere.
And we'll certainly follow the story. A New York City grand jury has finally decided to indict a police officer for the fatal shooting of an unarmed black man. 28-year-old Akai Gurley was shot and killed by Officer Peter Liang in the stairwell of a Brooklyn housing project last November 20th. It's not yet known what charges Mr. Liang faces. Meanwhile, another incident of police violence has come to light in Huntsville, Alabama. A 57-year-old Indian man who was visiting his son's family was severely beaten by 2 white police officers from the neighboring town of Madison last week. According to media reports, the attack left Mr. Suresh Bhai Patel, quote, bleeding from the face, paralyzed, and in need of surgery to fuse 2 vertebrae. An attorney retained by Patel's family speculated, I think it was because he looked brown. Mr. Patel is not fluent in English and apparently attempted to explain that he was visiting his son during the altercation. The attorney added, quote, it just takes a little bit of miscommunication and the officer thinks violence is the solution. Courtney, do you agree that our police officers are trained to respond at the drop of a hat with violence? Of course, especially if the people they're interacting with are black or brown.
I think absolutely. I mean, I think both of these cases really point to how widespread this culture of racist policing really is in our country. I mean, black and brown people do not enjoy full and equal protection under the law. And I think that it's clear that they can have zero expectation that their civil liberties will be respected or protected when they interface with law enforcement. And so this is really a very serious problem that requires real reform, and that won't happen until the federal government really steps in to rein in these overwhelming abuses of power by the police.
And finally, in international news, a major European summit in Belarus will attempt to tackle the ongoing crisis in Ukraine starting today. Russian President Vladimir Putin just announced that he will attend the summit personally. German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President François Hollande will also be present. At stake is whether the conflict between Western Europe and Russia over Ukraine will result in a truce or a full-blown war. The United Nations has estimated that already more than 5,000 people have died and nearly 13,000 wounded since the start of the conflict. The U.S. and many European nations have been supplying Ukraine's military with weapons, while Ukrainian separatist rebels have received support from Russia. Ukraine's President Petro Poroshenko has called for, quote, an immediate, absolute, and entirely unconditional ceasefire and to start a political dialogue. Well, Courtney, how serious is the situation, and what is the likelihood that a truce could be struck?
Well, the stakes are very high, and I think that there are members, some of the involved parties in these negotiations understand just how high these stakes are, and really what the dangers that lie ahead of us if we aren't able to negotiate some kind of ceasefire in Ukraine. It seems, though, that there seems to be some talk from the members of the Russian delegation who are participating in the talks that certainly that there is an interest in seeing these talks conclude successfully. One Russian official said under anonymity that he believed that there was about a 70% chance that things could be worked out. But we have some very loud hawks who are talking here in the United States from both sides of the aisle, urging President Obama to arm Ukraine in its conflict with Russia. And this, I think, would be a mistake. If we do that, Russia will almost certainly read that as an act of aggression and will further escalate its own aggression in Ukraine. And so the talks today that are happening are critical and really are necessary if we are going to avoid basically a civil war in Ukraine that would be a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia. So it's quite serious.
Courtney Morris, always a pleasure to have you on. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you next week.
Bye, Sonali.
Courtney Morris is our daily Newsflash guest expert on Wednesdays. She's an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll speak with Bryan Stevenson about a new report just released by the Equal Justice Initiative about lynchings in the United States. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. You can now watch Uprising at our YouTube channel online, youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Please do subscribe. Stories of fatal police violence against unarmed black men abound every week across the United States. In the months since Michael Brown's killing sparked a movement labeled Black Lives Matter, many have drawn connections to the U.S.'s sordid history of lynchings of African Americans. Now, the Equal Justice Initiative, after years of careful investigation, has found that the horrific practice was more widespread than previously known. Examining historical archives from 12 southern states in the years between the Reconstruction period and World War II, EJI found that 700 more people were lynched than earlier documents suggest. The grim tally now stands at 3,959. EJI has used the term racial terror to describe lynchings and maintains that these were not isolated incidents carried out by racist vigilantes. Rather, they were group activities that were often family affairs, attracting white picnickers and their children to enjoy it as a spectator sport. The report notes that no one was ever convicted of murder by lynching during this period. Bryan Stevenson is my guest. He is the founder and the executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative based in Montgomery, Alabama, and he's now joining us on the phone. Welcome to Uprising, Bryan. Okay, we're going to try to get him on the phone in just a moment. So essentially, this report is a major groundbreaking report that investigates the history between the years 1877 to 1950, a very specific time period and a very specific set of states. The states in particular: Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. And through very careful research that went on for many years, the report has finally been released and carefully documented the extent of lynching in the United States. 3,959 people in all were lynched in these 12 states, as far as the report's authors know, during that period of more than 50 years. And again, we're going to try to get Bryan Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative on with us. He is on the phone with us now. Welcome to Uprising, Bryan. Hi, Bryan. Can you hear us? Okay, we're going to try to get Bryan. Actually, we'll just take a short break while we try to reach him on the phone with us. Do bear with us and some of our technical issues. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. Joining me now is Bryan Stevenson, who is the director of the Equal Justice Initiative. Welcome to Uprising, Bryan.
Thank you. Delighted to be with you.
Tell us, what was the basis of the research for this report? Was it essentially historical news archives, or did you have surviving witnesses or original testimonies as well?
We use a really variety of sources. We started with the collected research that had been compiled by Professor Stuart Tolnay, University of Washington, and Professor Woody Beck, University of Georgia. They had done a pretty extensive study in 1995. So we looked at their data, and then we looked at archive files at Tuskegee University, which has long been regarded as the most comprehensive source for information about lynchings. And then what we did was we went to hundreds of sites across the country and did local research in courthouses, in historical archives, in newspapers. We checked Black newspapers and local newspapers, and found dozens of new reports about lynchings that had not previously been identified. And from there, we did some interviews with survivors, family members, community residents, and through that confirmed about 700 more lynchings than had previously been identified.
Why was it so important? Why is it so important to get a full accounting of this issue?
Well, I think this country has really been compromised by our failure to talk about racial history honestly, our failure to deal with the legacy that has been created by issues like lynching. We've been doing work for a few years now trying to change the narrative. I mean, we have this, I think, false idea that racial history in this country is uncomplicated by a narrative that still undermines race relations. I think the great evil of slavery wasn't involuntary servitude, but it was a narrative of racial difference, this ideology of white supremacy, that people of color are deficit, not fully human, that really compromised our forward progress. And at the end of the Civil War, in my judgment, slavery didn't end, it evolved. It turned into this era where we had decades of violence and intimidation and terrorism aimed at forcing Black people to be compliant, subordinate, and cooperative in a system of racial hierarchy. And these terror lynchings were the very powerful expressions of that ideology. And it so traumatized people of color that they fled. And that's how we have people of color now in Cleveland, Chicago, and throughout the country.
Right. How did you, for the purposes of this report, define what a lynching was? I mean, was it essentially the practice of hanging someone, or did you include other gruesome methods of murder as well?
Yeah, I think that we were looking at things that had four components. First of all, it had to be done by someone in an extrajudicial way. It had to be unaccompanied by a legal trial or process. It was typically done by people who had no fear of accountability. This wasn't done by masked people. It wasn't a hate crime where people had to get away with it. It always involved at least three perpetrators, and some involved hundreds, thousands of people participating in these events in carnival-like atmosphere. And then the fourth thing is that we were looking at racial terror lynchings. These are lynchings of African Americans, where the act of the lynching wasn't directed just at that particular victim, but the entire community of color.
And of course, the primary victims were African American men, but were there instances where women and children or even whole families were lynched?
Oh, absolutely. We've documented several instances where when an African American man had fled, his wife or his children would be lynched as his proxy. There's some horrific lynchings that took place involving pregnant women where their bodies were mutilated and tortured, and all kinds of horrific barbarism would sometimes accompany these dramatic acts of group violence.
And why did you pick the 12 states in question? Is that where all the lynchings took place or where most of the lynchings took place?
Yeah, no, we actually just focused on the 12 states that had the highest number of lynching. We were looking at the places where the threat of terror was most intense, and our theory was the more lynchings that took place in a state, the more traumatizing, the more acute the history of lynching would be. And so we focused on these 12 states because they recorded the highest numbers of lynchings in America. Lynchings took place all over the country. There were lynchings, public spectacle lynchings, where thousands of people attended in places like Minnesota, in places in the West, in places in the North, in places in the East. But they were most acute and most unchallenged for the longest period of time in the 12 states that we highlight in our report.
So if somebody were to do a comprehensive history throughout the entire country, the number would probably be higher than 3,959.
Oh yeah, no, we are just highlighting the number of lynchings of Black people in these 12 states. We know that there are thousands of other victims of racial terror. We just can't confirm the deaths of these people. There were instances like in Elaine, Arkansas, where scores of people were murdered, and sometimes these lynchings would spill over into the community where dozens of people of color would be murdered. And because we can't confirm those deaths, we don't count them. But there's no question that this is a very underreported phenomenon. This number does not in any way reflect all of the racial violence, the lynching violence even, that has taken place in this country.
Now, tell us about what the infractions, either real or perceived, that African Americans were lynched for, and if these were even necessarily considered crimes in any legal sense.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because I think there's a perception that people were lynched for accusations of violent crime, when in fact, oftentimes people would be lynched for basically violating social norms, social transgression. Jesse Thornton was lynched in Laverne, Alabama in 1940 because he addressed a police officer without using the word Mr.
Wow.
An African-American man was lynched in Mississippi because he was running to catch a train and he bumped into a white girl. William Little was lynched after World War I when he returned back to Blakely, Georgia in his U.S. Military uniform, and the people demanded that he take his uniform off. He wouldn't, and he was lynched. There were people in Dyersburg, Tennessee who were lynched for banging on the front door of a white person's home instead of the back door. And these social transgressions made up about 25% of the lynchings that we documented. And even when there were lynchings for accusations of rape or murder, they would frequently be in no way substantiated. We had people who were lynched for allegedly killing some white person who then showed up back in town 2 days after the lynching and asserted that he had just gone away. And these tragic miscarriages of injustice and brutality had very little to do with what we think of when we talk about crime and punishment. This was about something much more insidious. It was really about terrorizing Black people for any provocation that disrupted the racial order.
Now, the lynchings were usually reported by the press. It was all done quite out into the open. Sometimes African Americans, I understand, were even arrested by police and then turned over to white citizens to be lynched. How did white politicians justify allowing the lynchings to be taken place, since they were, of course, technically illegal acts of murder being carried out publicly, sometimes in broad daylight, in full view of the public, with picnickers enjoying the spectacle?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think that's one of the interesting parts of the conversation that we really want to elevate, because this was basically endorsed, sanctioned, often facilitated by systems of justice. Sheriffs would turn over these people from the courthouse. Governors would refuse to intervene. Sometimes you'd see news articles promoting, advertising a mass lynching that would take place later in the day. And so you're right, elected officials were complicit. What they would sometimes say is that we can't control the mob. The people want this. It would be even more disastrous if we tried to disrupt it. And it really reveals the way in which these lynchings took place, not on behalf of a handful of aggrieved victims, but on behalf of everyone who supported racial hierarchy, who supported the kind of subordination that dominated this era when it came to managing people of color. And it's one of the great frustrations is that the federal government did not intervene despite multiple requests from the NAACP, from other organizations demanding that there be some order to save and protect the lives of these people.
Now, Bryan, eventually the practice did die out, but how is the dying out of the practice linked to the use and the practice of the death penalty in our legal system?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting story. When the federal government began to threaten sending in federal troops to stop these lynchings, state and local officials then had to act in greater earnest to end lynching. And they began promising people that they could effectuate the same outcome, a dead body. They just wanted time to have a show trial, these little quick, very unreliable proceedings that they would call a trial. And that became the beginning of the modern death penalty in many of the states where we currently see the death penalty. And it's in these same 12 states that the death penalty was embraced, it was utilized, it was frequently applied only against African-American defendants, almost always for cases involving white victims. And in 1972, the court struck down the death penalty as being racially biased and discriminatory. But of course, states, including these 12 states, led the charge to resurrect the modern death penalty, which also continues to show some of these same features. Race of the victim remains the greatest predictor of who gets the death penalty today. Every study that's looked at the death penalty in each of these states has found tremendous evidence of racial bias and discrimination. And one of the things that I believe is necessary for this project, in terms of marking and monumentalizing these incidents, is to kind of think again about why we would want to execute people in this country with this legacy and history of racial violence. You know, I go to Germany and you talk about the death penalty there, and people say, well, we of course can never again put people in a gas chamber and execute them. It would be unconscionable for our society to do that. And it would be. They recognize their history of the Holocaust disqualifies them from engaging in that kind of behavior. Yet in this country, we do the opposite. Not only do we still execute people, but we still execute people in ways where these race disparities are ignored and not addressed. And that's one of the reasons why we want to deal with this issue so acutely.
Finally, Bryan Stevenson, people of color are not only more disproportionately likely to receive the death penalty, but they're, of course, disproportionately likely to be picked up and be forced to enter the criminal justice system. And that starts on the streets with altercations between police officers and civilians. And just as there had been no conviction of any person involved in a lynching in the years that your report examined, the idea of a conviction of a police officer today in the killing of an unarmed black man is almost unheard of. Is it fair to draw those parallels as well?
I do. I think that we have created this presumption of guilt and dangerousness that follows African-American boys and men, people of color. And it's one of the reasons why young men and boys feel so menaced and threatened. It is the reason why there are these real disparities in who are the victims of police violence and use of force. I think it does contribute to our resistance, our reluctance to hold officers accountable when many of these instances take place. And I do think that we've allowed this presumption of guilt and dangerousness to continue to compromise our ability to provide safety to all, justice to all, and fair treatment to all. And I think part of what we're hoping to do is kind of deal more soberly with this history, to kind of commit ourselves to truth and reconciliation so that maybe we can turn a corner on not only our historical understanding of these issues, but our contemporary challenges from everything from police violence to a reliable administration of criminal justice and fair punishment.
Bryan, I want to thank you very much for joining us today, and best of luck to you with the report.
Thank you.
My guest is Bryan Stevenson. He's the founder and the executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative based in Montgomery, Alabama. On December 7th, 1964, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave an hour-long speech at Temple Hall in London on his way to Oslo to claim the Nobel Peace Prize that he had been given just a few decades after the practice of lynchings had finally slowly begun to end. And of course, it signaled the rise of the civil rights movement. It was a time of intense transformation in the United States. And when he got his Nobel Prize, it was only months after the passage of the Civil Rights Act and months before the Voting Rights Act was enacted. The actual speech given by Dr. King was lost to history, and the only piece of it that ever remained was a 2-minute, 45-second video from the BBC, which reported it. But 50 years later, the Pacifica Radio Archives discovered the entire recording of the 62-minute-long speech, hidden for decades in its vault. Brian DeShazer, director of the Pacifica Radio Archives, discovered the speech in real format and oversaw its preservation. And now, more than 50 years later, the audio of that speech is available once more. Today, in honor of Black History Month, we'll play an excerpt of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King speaking in London City Temple Hall on December 7th, 1964.
I want to talk with you mainly about our struggle in the United States, and before taking my seat, talk about some of the larger struggles in the whole world, and some of the more difficult struggles in places like South Africa. But that is a desperate, poignant question on the lips of people all over our country and all over the world. I get it almost everywhere I go and almost every press conference. It is a question of whether we are making any real progress in the struggle to make racial justice a reality in the United States of America. And whenever I seek to answer that question, on the one hand, I seek to avoid an undue pessimism. On the other hand, I seek to avoid a superficial optimism. And I try to incorporate or develop what I consider a realistic position, by admitting on the one hand that we have made many significant strides over the last few years in the struggle for racial justice, but by admitting that before the problem is solved, we still have numerous things to do and many challenges to meet. And it is this realistic position that I would like to use as a basis for our thinking together tonight as we think about the problem in the United States. We have come a long, long way, but we have a long, long way to go before the problem is solved. Now let us notice first that we've come a long, long way, and I would like to say at this point that the Negro himself has come a long, long way in re-evaluating his own intrinsic worth. Now, in order to illustrate this, a little history is necessary. It was in the year 1619 when the first Negro slaves landed on the shores of America. And they were brought there from the soils of Africa. Unlike the Pilgrim Fathers who landed at Plymouth a year later, they were brought there against their wills. And throughout slavery, the Negro was treated in a very inhuman fashion. He was a thing to be used, not a person to be respected. The United States Supreme Court rendered a decision in 1857 known as the Dred Scott decision, which well illustrated this whole idea and which well illustrated what existed at that time. But in this decision, the Supreme Court of the United States said in substance that the Negro is not a citizen of the United States. He is merely property subject to the dictates of his owner. And it went on to say that the Negro has no rights that the white man is bound to respect. And this was the idea that prevailed during the days of slavery. With the growth of slavery, it became necessary to give some justification for it. You know, it seems to be a fact of life that human beings cannot continue to do wrong without eventually reaching out for some thin rationalization to clothe an obvious wrong in the beautiful garments of righteousness. And this is exactly what happened during the days of slavery. There were those who even misused the Bible and religion to give some justification for slavery and to crystallize the patterns of the status quo. And so it was argued from some pulpits that the Negro was inferior by nature because of Noah's curse upon the children of Ham. And then the Apostle Paul's dictum became a watchword: servants, be obedient to your master. And one brother had probably read the logic of the great philosopher Aristotle. You know, Aristotle did a great deal to bring into being what we now know as formal logic in philosophy. And in formal logic, that is a big word known as the syllogism, which has a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. And so this brother decided to put his argument for the inferiority of the Negro in the framework of an Aristotelian syllogism. He could say all men are made in the image of God. This was the major premise. Then came the minor premise. God, as everybody knows, is not a Negro. Therefore, the Negro is not a man. This was the kind of reasoning that prevailed. Well, living with the conditions of slavery and then later segregation, many Negroes lost faith in themselves. Many came to feel that perhaps they were less than human. Many came to feel that they were inferior. This, it seems to me, is the greatest tragedy of slavery, the greatest tragedy of segregation, not merely what it does to the individual physically, but what it does to one psychologically. It scars the soul of the segregated as well as the segregator. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority while leaving the segregated with a false sense of inferiority. And this is exactly what happened. But then something happened to the Negro. And circumstances made it possible and necessary for him to travel more. The coming of the automobile, the upheavals of 2 world wars, the Great Depression. And so his rural plantation background gradually gave way to urban industrial life. His economic life was gradually rising through the growth of industry, the development of organized labor, and expanded educational opportunities. And even his cultural life was gradually rising through the steady decline of crippling illiteracy. All of these forces conjoined to cause the Negro in America to take a new look at himself. Negro masses all over began to reevaluate themselves. And then something else happened along with all of this. The Negro in the United States turned his eyes and his mind to Africa. And he noticed the magnificent drama of independence taking place on the stage of African history. And noticing the developments, and noticing what was happening, and noticing what was being done on the part of his black brothers and sisters in Africa, gave him a new sense of dignity in the United States and a new sense of self-respect. The Negro came to feel that he was somebody. His religion revealed to him that God loves all of his children and that all men are made in his image, and that the basic thing about a man is not his specificity but his fundamentum, not the texture of his hair or the color of his skin, but his eternal dignity and worth. And so the Negro in America could now cry out unconsciously with the eloquent poet, "Fleecy locks and black complexion cannot forfeit nature's claim. Skin may differ, but affection dwells in black and white the same. And were I so tall as to reach the pole or to grasp the ocean at a span, I must be measured by my soul. The mind is the standard of the man." And with this new sense of dignity and this new sense of self-respect, a new Negro came into being with a new determination to suffer, to struggle, to sacrifice, and even to die if necessary in order to be free. And this reveals that we have come a long, long way since 1619. But if we're to be true to the facts, it is necessary to say that not only has the Negro re-evaluated his own intrinsic worth, the whole nation has come a long, long way in extending the frontiers of civil rights.
You have been listening to an excerpt of a December 7th, 1964 speech by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that he gave at Temple Hall in London on his way to Oslo to claim his Nobel Peace Prize. The speech was lost to history and then newly unearthed just recently from the Pacifica Radio Archives, and it's not preserved anywhere else. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. You can now watch Uprising on Free Speech TV, which airs on Dish Network, Channel 9415, DirecTV Channel 348, and on hundreds of part-time cable affiliates and on Roku. HSBC, the world's second largest bank, is once more at the center of a major scandal, this time over its Swiss private bank, which apparently actively advised its fabulously wealthy clients on how to hide deposits from tax collectors. A list of clients stolen by Mr. Hervé Falciani, a computer tech employee of HSBC in 2007, is at the heart of the revelations. Referred to as the Lagarde list after then French Finance Minister Christine Lagarde, it contains details about tax evaders from a number of countries, including the US, Britain, France, and Spain. The list was turned over to authorities of all four governments as well as several media outlets. The data leaked by Falciani contained information for 106,000 clients from 203 countries with more than $100 billion in deposits. The bank has counted among its clients drug lords, arms traffickers, blood diamond dealers, and even members of Arab dictatorial regimes. In 2012, the U.S. brokered a deal overseen by Loretta Lynch, who now faces Senate confirmation for Attorney General, that allowed HSBC to keep its U.S. charter after revelations that the bank helped Mexican drug cartels launder billions of dollars. It now appears that the government had knowledge of the tax evasion practices when that deal was struck. Among those questioning the 2012 deal is Senator Sherrod Brown, who has vowed to pursue officials at the Justice Department and the IRS. The DOJ announced this week that it was considering revisiting the deal and could pursue prosecution over the tax evasion. My guest is William Black. He's an associate professor of economics and law at the University of Missouri in Kansas City. He's a white-collar criminologist, former financial regulator, and his book is called The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One. Welcome to the show, William. We are going to try to bring him back on the Skype call with us. William Black, again, is our guest, and the name of his book is The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One. And again, he is also the Associate Professor of Economics and Law at the University of Missouri in Kansas City. And we're going to talk to him about HSBC. HSBC, now known by its acronym, originally known as the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation. Are you with us, William?
I am.
Great. So let's focus, before we talk about some of the other scandals for which HSBC is known, particularly the 2012 deal over the drug money laundering, let's focus on this latest scandal. Now, Swiss bank accounts aren't illegal, right? I mean, don't we have this labyrinth of tax laws with lots of loopholes big enough to slide billions of dollars through legally? What exactly was illegal about HSBC's Swiss bank dealings?
Well, many things were illegal, and they depend on individual circumstances, as you say, because it isn't illegal per se to have a Swiss account. And Swiss law is very unusual in saying that just because we're helping you evade taxation, and even though that would be a crime in your country, it's not a crime in Switzerland. But it is a crime to evade taxes, and this would typically mean making false statements when you did pay your taxes. And that, after all, is why many of these, in fact, the overwhelming bulk of these people had these secret accounts in Switzerland in order to make false statements and avoid paying taxes.
So let's talk about how HSBC itself has reacted to this information. Do they have a justification for essentially actively advising so many of its clients on how to hide their money from tax collectors?
They don't have a good explanation at law, and they didn't just help advise them. They would actually take affirmative steps, warn them that the authorities might be looking, provide what were referred to as bricks of $100 bills. So these would be thousands of $100 bills put together with plastic and such. You may have seen your viewers some of these pallets of money in Afghanistan and in Iraq from the United States. That's what this stuff would look like for people. Again, this is, remember, at a time of record low taxation that was supposed to, it was sold in part to the American people and the British people, that if we had these much lower tax rates, the rich would stop using these Swiss devices and be willing to pay their taxes. No, it's exactly the opposite. It just encouraged them to try to make sure they paid virtually no taxes.
So why is this story gaining traction now? I mean, these names, this client list of 100,000 people or more, was first obtained several years ago, was turned over to governments. What has changed?
Well, you're right. So let's emphasize again, this information was taken over 7 years ago. And on top of that, it was given to the governments at least 5 years ago, and in some cases perhaps longer. So the United Kingdom, for example, has a list of over 1,000 tax evaders, and it is prosecuted in those 5+ years that it's had this information, exactly one person.
Wow.
The Swiss government is eagerly seeking to prosecute one individual, the whistleblower. The United States, as you said, Loretta Lynch should be in terminal trouble on her nomination, because they had all this information and they gave an incredible sweetheart deal to HSBC, which, as you said, is the second largest bank in the world and one that is notorious in terms of its violations of law. So they were actually settling in that case a half dozen different types of crime, but tens of thousands of felonious actions. And not a single person at HSBC was prosecuted. Not a single person at HSBC lost their job as a result of the non-prosecution. Not a single person lost their bonus as a result. So it's a complete outrage. The United Kingdom minister just yesterday, the regulator, it's called their FCA, had described this latest one, the HSBC, the one that we're talking about, as part of what he called a staggering record of scandals and felonies by the largest banks in the world. And get this, he blamed the tax authorities for not telling him and said he'd have to look into information sharing. But of course, as you said, this has actually been public. There have been a number of news reports that this Lagarde list existed. And all he had to do was pick up the phone and ask the tax authorities. And of course, he never did that and now wants to, blame it all on the tax people. No. But in the United States, the Justice Department knew these things. And not only did they give a free pass to HSBC, but they gave pretty darn close to a free pass to Credit Suisse, which had similar and in some ways even worse tax evasion. So it's part of the pattern of why even today, well after the 2008 crisis with Lehman Brothers, there's not a single senior banker in the United States that has been prosecuted for his or her role in leading the fraud epidemics that caused the crisis.
So let's talk about some of the other scandals that this bank has been involved in. To put this into perspective, this is the nth time that HSBC has been found, a third in particular in terms of what has been revealed. But there was the money laundering issue, where essentially it was laundering money for the Sinaloa drug cartel in Mexico. I mean, this is essentially propping up a horrifically murderous set of individuals to hide their blood money. There was a currency rigging scandal, which also enabled the rich to get richer. And the kinds of penalties that this bank has faced has essentially, I understand, amounted to a few weeks' worth of profit. When the penalties are so paltry, obviously there's no prohibitive effect. Is this a case of basically everybody agreeing that this bank is just too big to fail, and so we should allow it to enable murderers and mass killers?
Well, as I usually say at this point, I am in awe of modern financial regulators. When I was a financial regulator, I was nowhere near as sophisticated. I never understood that the key to achieving financial stability was leaving felons in charge of your largest financial institutions in the world.
So, when we, again, put this into perspective, I mean, I'm thinking about Muslim Americans here in the United States who have been prosecuted and jailed or deported for donating to Islamic charities that were dubiously connected to, jihadist groups. But here's a bank that has actively enabled a murderous drug gang, blood diamond dealers, arms traffickers, and it's not even, again, not a single person being prosecuted. So what do you think needs to happen? Because, of course, people are worried about the stability of the global markets if we actively dismantle HSBC by, for example, not allowing it to keep its U.S. charter. I mean, would that really have such a huge ripple effect on the global economy that we just have to leave HSBC alone?
Oh, no, it would have a wondrously positive effect on the economy if we were to get rid of corrupt banks. So the standard conservative economic phrase is to praise creative destruction, the idea that capitalism sweeps away bad companies. Well, there's no more creative destruction possible than getting rid of a criminal enterprise, which is what HSBC has been for at least a decade. In addition to the ones you talked about, they also were involved in the LIBOR scandal. And that affected $350 trillion in transactions when they rigged that price. A trillion is 1,000 billion. Right, so that is the biggest fraud in world history. And then they were heavily involved in the foreign exchange gimmicking. And they and Standard Chartered, in addition to being involved in the Sinaloa drug cartel, also were funding genocidal regimes in Sudan and such. So there are literally no moral restraints at all. They were willing to knowingly aid just small-time thugs and kleptocrats and, peers. By the way, it's not just that they got off with a slap on the wrist, though they did. The Tories, the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom, when they came to power, made the former head of HSBC a peer and a minister in their parliament, in their cabinet. So they've actually rewarded the people that were in charge when this became and maintained itself as a criminal enterprise now for at least 2 decades and such. So unless and until we're willing to take them on, nothing's going to happen. Now, even in the rare case where there is a weak criminal sanction, we have now created a faux guilty plea that's available only to big banks. And under this faux guilty plea, we negotiate in advance that the normal consequences of being a felon, after all, you have no right to be a bank operating in a country. That's a privilege. And it's a privilege that's supposed to be available only to honest banks and bankers. And of course, HSBC, as we've gone through, has at least a dozen massive felonies. And these are just categories of felonies. Again, there are tens of thousands of felonious acts in each of these categories, typically. So normally they would be have their license revoked. They would have had the license revoked at least a decade ago. But now when they plead guilty, we negotiated in advance that they won't lose their license or that it will be limited and typically only for 1 year. So this is, the people that are going to destroy what they call capitalism are the big bankers, and they are actively doing it. So,
William, let's talk about the political will here in the United States to actually do something real this time rather than the sweetheart deal that of the kind that Lynch brokered last time a couple of years ago. What about Senator Sherrod Brown, who at least seems to be giving lip service to the outrage that should be widespread throughout Congress? He has said that he's going to, take the bank to task and really question officials in the DOJ, IRS, etc. And then what about the long-term solution of really reforming our tax code so that it's very explicitly illegal to move your money offshore, which is also an issue that needs some work, I think.
Right. So Senator Brown is someone who is actually trying to make things better. It isn't lip service, nor is it with Senator Warren. But, so how much outrage have you heard from the President of the United States and the Attorney General?
Right. Stunning silence. At least, certainly President Obama. Eric Holder, I think, has said that he wants to take a closer look at the 2012 deal.
Yeah, that's outrage. So, we were just told in a rather infamous interview in which the interviewer asked Holder to quack like a duck, that the interviewer considered him a duck because he was serene above the water, but he was paddling furiously below the water.
Wow.
Well, of course, on banks and bankers, he has done no such thing during his entire tenure. And his replacement that they chose was the person who delivered this obscenity that was not even a slap on the wrist to HSBC. So they're looking for continuity. And, this was a freebie, right? There was only good things could have happened politically and substantively to President Obama if he had immediately come out and denounced this and demanded the absolute application of the rule of law in its full severity to HSBC. That would have been just pure plus.
And then any thoughts on reforming the tax code to explicitly start taking, offshore money and hiding offshore money illegal?
Right. There's no reason why you should be able to have any significant offshore accounts as an individual. Businesses, do have some needs obviously for accounts abroad. But individuals have no substantial need. You could certainly limit it to $100,000 maximum total everywhere in the world, and require that you file a disclosure with the IRS whenever you created such an account. But we all know that none of that is going to happen, although certainly individual legislators, one will hope, will put those bills in, but they will clearly be killed by the majority, and pretty clearly they would have no administration support either.
Do you think Loretta Lynch will face any opposition to her confirmation based on this story, or is it just going to be swept under the rug?
She'll face a few nasty questions and comments, and maybe a couple of people additionally will vote against her. But unless something really comes out, like one of her members of her team saying, yes, I tried to prevent this and warned about this HSBC tax stuff, and she overcame me and fired me. And there's no indication something like that is going to happen. It certainly looks greased that she will be a fitting successor to Eric Holder's record of complete failure.
Thank you so much, William Black, as always, for putting these issues into perspective.
Thank you.
William Black has been my guest. He is an associate professor of economics and law at the University of Missouri in Kansas City, and he's a white-collar criminologist and former financial regulator. His book is called The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Christian Beck is our production assistant. Jonathan Alexander and Federico Garcia are our audio engineers. Camilo Ramirez is our sound editor. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprisingwithsonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kohatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you tomorrow.